Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever tried to send or receive, a small gift from outside the European Union, maybe to a friend or family member living in another EU country?
Uh-huh.
You might think it's straightforward, right?
Hmm.
A simple gesture. But when it comes to taxes, especially VAT, value-added tax, well, things can get surprisingly complicated.
Yeah, even within the EU, which is supposed to be, borderless.
Exactly. You'd assume when something is in the EU, it's just in, full stop.
Mm.
But maybe prepare for a bit of an aha moment today,
Mhm.
because this deep dive is all about a recent and pretty crucial ruling from the European Court of Justice. It directly impacts these kinds of everyday scenarios.
Right.
We're going to explore the complexities of VAT exemptions for these small, non-commercial cross-border shipments and really try to nail down precisely what cross-border truly means within the EU for these imports.
Yeah, it's more nuanced than you might think.
Our mission today really is to pull out the key bits of knowledge from what looks like a legal maze and hopefully give you those moments of clarity, so you feel properly informed about this specific but quite common point of EU tax law.
And it's a fascinating story, really, about how national interpretations can sometimes clash with that bigger vision of a unified Europe.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So what are we using to guide us through this? What are our sources?
Okay, so to get through this legal landscape, we've got some absolutely critical source material. At the very heart of it is the European Court of Justice's own provisional judgment. It's from May 2025, case C1524.
Right.
It involves a Polish company, LSC, versus their national tax authority, the director Krajowicz Informacji Skarbowicz. That judgment, well, that's the definitive word from the highest EU court. It's really our starting point for everything.
That's the main event then, the cornerstone.
Yeah.
But I guess to really get what that judgment means, we need the background, the rules it's interpreting.
Exactly. You can't understand the ruling without understanding the rules themselves. So we also delve into the foundational EU directives. First, there's Council Directive 2006/11/EC.
Okay.
You can think of that as the grand blueprint for the common system of VAT across the whole EU. It sets the framework, how VAT works everywhere from Portugal to Poland.
The big picture for VAT.
Right. And then, more specifically for our topic, we have Directive 2006/79/EC. This one zooms right in. It's like a detailed plan focusing precisely on the tax exemptions for imports of those small, non-commercial consignments we're talking about.
The specific rule for small gifts, basically.
Pretty much. And these aren't just, dry legal texts.
Yeah.
They are the actual framework the ECJ had to interpret. They show what the EU is trying to achieve in harmonizing these complex tax issues.
Makes sense.
And to help tie it all together, we've also looked at a really helpful analytical piece from VidAbout. It was published just after the ruling, and it does a great job breaking down the implications in a more accessible way.
Oh, good. Connecting the legal stuff to the real world.
Yeah, it helps connect those dense legal dots to what it actually means for people and businesses. And finally, we'll also touch on some earlier but still relevant regulations, like Council Regulation 9183 and its successor, 1186/2009.
Okay, why those?
Well, they set some of the initial precedents for these kinds of exemptions, specifically for customs duties. It shows how these rules have sort of evolved over decades, always aiming for that idea of a common market.
Okay, so we've got a solid set of sources then. The ECJ judgment, the key EU directives, that VidAbout analysis, and even some historical context. Plenty to dig into.
Absolutely. It gives us multiple angles to understand what seems like a simple question about sending a gift.
Right. So to really appreciate why the ECJ even had to rule on this, we need to understand the original dispute. What sparked this whole legal journey? Let's start right there. Where did it all begin?
Okay, the spark, as you said, it came from Poland. It involved a company called LSC. Now, this company, they operate in logistics, freight forwarding, customs clearance, really crucial stuff.
The people who actually move the goods across borders.
Exactly. They're the ones orchestrating how goods move internationally. So their day-to-day involves navigating this incredibly complex maze of import rules, tax regulations for tons of packages coming into and moving around the EU.
Right.
In legal terms, LSE is a taxable person. That just means they're an entity that has to understand and apply tax rules, and often they collect taxes for the government. They're right there on the front lines of customs and trade.
So they really need the rules to be clear. They're not just moving boxes, they're handling the legal and financial side too. Very sensitive to any gray areas in tax law, I imagine.
Absolutely. Any ambiguity costs them time, money, potentially penalties.
And who are they up against in this specific dispute?
Their counterpart was the Director Kryjewicz Informacji Skarbowej. That's basically the Director of National Tax Information in Poland. Simply put, the Polish tax authority.
Okay.
And LSC went to them, not fighting a specific past case, but asking for a binding tax ruling beforehand. They wanted a clear, official answer to a very specific question that was causing them problems, operational uncertainty.
So they were trying to do the right thing, get clarity up front.
Exactly. It's a standard process for businesses trying to ensure they comply correctly and avoid issues down the line.
And what was that core question? What was the specific problem LSE had that ended up going all the way to the highest court in the EU?
Right. LSE's problem was very specific, but actually quite common in the logistics world. They needed to know, could an import of goods into Poland be exempt from VAT if the final recipient, the private person getting the goods, was actually located in a different EU member state?
Oh.
Say someone in France or Germany, not Poland itself. And we're talking specifically about those small, non-commercial consignments. Gifts from family abroad, maybe a small souvenir someone bought online from outside the EU, not big commercial shipments.
Right. So let me paint a picture. Say, my aunt in Canada sends me a scarf she knitted. It's worth, say, 30 euros. For whatever reason, the flight lands in Warsaw, Poland, but I live in Berlin, Germany. Does Poland get to charge VAT on that scarf just because it physically landed on their soil first, even though it's heading straight to me in Germany and meets all the small gift criteria?
That is exactly the question. That's the heart of the matter. And the Polish tax authority's initial answer, a clear no.
Really?
Yes. In a tax ruling back in February 2019, they said quite clearly that this VAT exemption only applied if the recipient, the consignee, actually resided in Poland.
Wow.
And this view was then backed up by Poland's Regional Administrative Court in Warsaw, the Wojewódzki Sąd Administracyjny w Warszawie, in December 2019. That court explicitly agreed. They said both the EU Directive, Article 1431b, and Poland's own national law, Article 52, meant the exemption required the recipient to be in the member state of importation, which, in your scarf example, would be Poland.
Okay, so the Polish authorities were adamant. For the Polish VAT exemption, the recipient must be in Poland, full stop. But LSE clearly didn't buy that. They appealed again.
They didn't. They felt this was fundamentally wrong, or at least inconsistent with the spirit of the EU. So they appealed to the Naczelny Sąd Administracji, that's Poland's Supreme Administrative Court. And this is where things got really interesting.
How so?
Because the Polish Supreme Court itself, which is fascinating, recognized there might be a problem, a potential conflict between Poland's own law and established EU principles.
Even the highest national court saw the tension.
Exactly. They acknowledged that Polish case law, and specifically Article 52 of their national VAT law, clearly tied the exemption to the recipient living in Poland. No doubt about that based on Polish law alone. But the Supreme Court was also aware of earlier EU case law, specifically a judgment called Harvesen Dwan Service from 2009. That case, C-708, strongly suggested that the initial entry point of goods into the EU shouldn't actually affect their VAT exemption status, as long as the recipient was somewhere within the broader EU customs territory.
So like you said before, once you're in the club, regardless of the door.
Pretty much. That EU ruling implied the exemption should travel with the goods across internal EU borders if they qualified at the point of entry.
So the Polish Supreme Court is stuck. Their national law says one thing, EU precedent seems to say another. That's a fundamental conflict, isn't it? It goes way beyond just VAT. How can national law contradict EU principles in a supposedly harmonized area?
It really highlights that constant friction, that dance between national legal systems and the push for EU-wide rules and integration. It happens more often than you might think.
So what did the Polish Supreme Court do? They couldn't just ignore it.
They couldn't, and this interpretive conflict was so fundamental, they did the crucial thing. They referred a question for a preliminary ruling to the European Court of Justice.
Asking the top EU court for the final word.
Exactly. It's a vital mechanism. It lets national courts ask the ECJ, hey, how should we interpret this bit of EU law to make sure it's applied the same way everywhere? The Polish court basically asked, is our national law, Article 52.1, compatible with the key EU VAT rules, specifically Article 143.1b of Directive 2006/112 and Article 1 of Directive 2006/79?
And I mentioned other bits too.
Yes, they specifically flagged Recital 3 of Directive 2006/79 and Article 25 of Regulation Regulation 1186/2009, signaling they wanted the ECJ to look at the whole picture, the context, the history, essentially asking the ECJ to define, once and for all, what a member state actually means for these VAT exemptions. The stage was set.
Okay, so before we jump into the ECJ's answer, let's make sure we really understand the EU rules they were looking at. You mentioned Directive 2006/11 as the big VAT blueprint.
That's right, it's the bedrock. Council Directive 2006/1110/EC. It lays out the common system of value-added tax for the entire EU. It's not optional, it dictates the general rules, what's taxed, what's not, and crucially, it requires member states to exempt certain things from VAT. Harmonization is key.
To stop things getting chaotic between countries.
Exactly. Without it, you'd have chaos, double taxation, unfair competition. It's fundamental to the single market.
Okay, so that's the big picture. But for these small gifts, the really important one is Directive 2006/79/EC, right?
Absolutely spot on. Directive 2006/79, and specifically its Article 1, Paragraph 1, is pivotal. It says, goods in small consignments of a non-commercial character sent from a third country by private persons to other private persons in a member state shall be exempt on importation from turnover tax and excise duty.
And there it is, that phrase, in a member state. That was the whole fight, wasn't it?
That was the absolute crux of it. That seemingly tiny, innocuous phrase. Did it mean any member state or the specific member state where the goods physically arrived?
Okay, but what qualifies? What exactly is a small consignment of a non-commercial character? You can't just send anything, right?
Yeah.
People would try to cheat the system.
Oh, definitely. And the directive is very clear on this to prevent abuse. Article 1, Paragraph 2 lays out 4 very specific conditions. It has to meet all of them.
Okay, what are they?
First, it must be occasional. So not regular repeating shipments. That stops businesses pretending to be individuals. If you get a package weekly from the same place, that's a red flag.
Makes sense. One-offs, basically.
Second, the goods must only be for the personal or family use of the recipient. And the nature and quantity shouldn't suggest any commercial purpose.
So 1 scarf is fine? 50 scarves? Probably not, even if you say they're for cousins?
Exactly. It's about genuine personal use, not stocking up a shop. Third, there's that strict value limit. Total value cannot exceed EUR 45.
45 euros? That's quite low.
It is. It's designed specifically for genuinely small value items. It makes collecting VAT administratively impractical anyway. It keeps the focus on minor gifts, not valuable goods.
Pragmatic. And the 4th condition.
Crucially, they must be sent without payment of any kind, from the sender to the recipient. It has to be a true gift or personal transfer. No money changing hands, no invoices involved. It can't be a sale disguised as a gift.
Okay, so occasional personal use only, under 45 euros, and absolutely free. That seems pretty clear. But you mentioned even more specific limits earlier, on things like cigarettes or wine.
Yes, and this is where the detail gets almost, well, comical, but it's deadly serious for customs. Article 2 of the same directive, 2006/79, adds another layer of restrictions. Even if the total value is under 45 euros, there are strict quantity limits for certain high-tax goods.
Like what? Give me examples.
Okay, so for tobacco, you're limited to, say, 50 cigarettes, or 10 cigars, or 50 grams of smoking tobacco. That's it. For alcohol, typically 1 liter of spirits over 22% alcohol, or 2 liters of still wine. Perfume, 50 grams. Coffee, 500 grams. Tea, 100 grams.
Wow, they really nail it down. I'm picturing a customs officer with tiny scales for the tea leaves.
It sounds funny, but these items carry high excise duties and VAT, so member states want very tight control to stop tax evasion or commercial imports sneaking through disguised as small gifts. It shows how detailed the EU's harmonized approach is, trying to allow genuine gifts but closing loopholes for high-tax items.
It's a balancing act, then. Allowing personal gestures, but preventing abuse. And this isn't a new idea, is it? These rules have history.
Oh, absolutely. There's a long lineage here. Directive 2006/79 is actually what they call a codified version. It tidied up earlier laws. The original was Directive 781035/EEC.
From 1978. Wow.
Yeah, and its Article 1.1 used almost identical wording to private persons in a member state. So this concept, exempting small personal import across the EU, has been around for decades. The legislative intent is consistent.
Okay. And you mentioned a link to customs duty rules, too. That seemed important.
Hugely important. Because even earlier, we had Regulation 9188/83. This wasn't about VAT, it was about relief from customs duties. And its Article 29 gave a similar exemption for small, non-commercial gifts sent to a private person living in the customs territory of the European Economic Community. The value limit back then was 35 ECU.
So even back then, for customs duties, they were thinking about the whole customs territory of the community, not just one country.
Precisely. And this connection is explicitly made in the VA directive we're discussing. Recital 3 of Directive 2006-79 states that for practical reasons, the VAT exemption limits should align as far as possible with the customs duty exemptions from Regulation 91883.
Ah, so the VH rules were deliberately designed to mirror the customs rules, which already had that EU-wide scope.
Exactly. It shows a consistent EU effort to align customs and VAT for simplicity and harmony. The logic is clear. If it's exempt from customs duty when entering the entire EU territory, why would the V8 exemption suddenly become restricted to just the entry country? It undermines the whole idea of a single customs union. That historical link was a big problem for Poland's argument.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Were there any other clues in the V8 directive itself that the ECJ might have looked at? You mentioned sometimes what isn't said is important.
That's a sharp point. And yes, the ECJ did briefly touch on this. They looked at other articles in the main VAT directive, 2006-11 articles dealing with things like where a supply takes place, Article 32, or how to calculate the taxable amount, Article 86, or preventing double tax, Article 163.
Right.
And those articles, when the location of import is the critical factor, the directive explicitly uses the phrase, the member state of importation.
Ah, so it uses the definite article when it means the specific country of entry.
Exactly. The fact that Article 11 of Directive 2006-79 doesn't use that specific phrase, but instead uses the indefinite a member state, becomes really significant in the ECJ's linguistic analysis. It strongly suggests the legislature deliberately chose broader wording for this specific exemption. They knew how to be specific when they wanted to be.
Okay, fascinating. So the stage is perfectly set. We have Poland's narrow view, the EU framework of its history and subtle language, and now the ECJ has to make the call. How do they approach it? You said it's a three-pronged analysis.
That's right. The ECJ has a very consistent method. They don't just read the words in isolation. They look at three things: the literal wording, the context, including history, and the purpose or objective, the why, behind the law. It's called a literal, contextual, and teleological interpretation.
Right. Ensures the law is applied uniformly and makes sense in the bigger picture.
Exactly. It stops narrow national readings undermining the whole EU project. So let's break down how they applied this to LSC's case.
Okay, let's start with the literal interpretation, the actual words. What do they make of in a member state?
Focusing squarely on Article 11 of Directive 2006-79, the court highlighted that indefinite Article A. They pointed out it wasn't just English. The equivalent indefinite article appeared in multiple official language versions: Spanish in, Danish in, German einem, French un, Italian uno, Dutch en, Romanian unui, Swedish en.
So across languages, it consistently suggested any rather than the specific one.
Precisely. That grammatical choice, the court argued, clearly implies any member state within the EU, not necessarily the specific one where the goods first landed. It points towards a broader geographical scope.
And this contrasted with other parts of the VAT law.
Yes, and that contrast was key. As we just discussed, the ECJ noted that other articles in the main VAT directive do explicitly say the member state of importation, when that's the intended meaning, like Articles 32, 86, 163.
Right.
The fact that the legislature used different wording here in Article 1 of 2006-79 strongly indicated a deliberate choice for a wider application. The literal text just didn't support restricting the exemption only to the country of physical entry.
Okay, the words point to any EU country. What about the context and the history? Did that back up the literal reading?
It absolutely did. The ECJ dug into the history, the travaux préparatoires or preparatory work. They went back to the original 1975 proposal for the first version of this directive, which became 781035.
And what did that show?
It showed that from the very beginning, the intention was never to tie the exemption to a specific place of destination within the EU. The consistent aim, right from the start, was for these low-value personal items to be exempt as long as they met the conditions anywhere in the EU. It wasn't about where they landed first.
So the historical blueprints matched the final text implication. And did the customs duty link play a role here too?
Yes, significantly. The court reinforced the alignment with the customs duty rules, Regulation 9/1883. Those rules, remember, applied broadly to the customs territory of the European Union without limiting relief to the specific country of entry.
And the VAT directive explicitly aimed to align with those customs rules.
Exactly. Recital 3 made that link explicit. So this historical and legislative consistency strongly pointed towards a harmonized EU-wide approach for both customs and VAT exemptions for these small consignments. The whole context screamed EU-wide, not country-specific. Poland's view looked increasingly isolated against this backdrop.
Okay, so the literal text says, any member state. The history confirms an EU-wide intent. Now the third prong, the teleological interpretation, the purpose, the why. Why do these exemptions even exist? What goal were they trying to achieve? This seems crucial.
It is absolutely crucial. This gets to the spirit of the law. The ECJ looked back at the original explanatory notes for the 1978 directive. Why did the EU want to create these exemptions?
And the reason was?
The stated objective was clear: to relax the arrangements for these small, non-commercial packages sent between private individuals from outside the EU. Why relax? Because these shipments are seen as essentially of an emotional character.
Gifts, tokens of affection.
Exactly. They also have only a low value, which, as we said, makes collecting tax burdensome. And importantly, the goods have usually already been subject to a tax in the country of dispatch. The EU wanted to avoid double taxing these small personal items and facilitate these connections.
Okay, so it's about easing burdens, fostering personal links, avoiding double tax on small emotional items. From that perspective, the why. Does it make any logical sense to suddenly apply VAT in Poland just because the package landed there, even if it's going to someone in Italy who meets all the criteria? Does that serve the purpose?
The ECJ's clear conclusion was no, it absolutely does not make sense from that perspective. The court found no logical reason, based on the purpose of the directive, to treat goods differently depending on whether the recipient was in the member state of importation or another member state.
The goal is the same regardless of where in the EU the recipient lives.
Precisely. The objective is to facilitate these low-value personal exchanges across EU borders. The underlying purpose simply doesn't support creating a national restriction based on the entry point. It's about the single market working for these small personal shipments, making internal EU geography irrelevant once the goods are properly inside.
So when you put all three together, the literal words, a member state, the consistent historical context of EU-wide application, and the fundamental purpose of facilitating these small personal gifts, it seems the ECJ had a very clear answer. What was the final decisive judgment?
The judgment was crystal clear, really definitive. Based on that comprehensive three-pronged analysis, literal, contextual, and teleological, the ECJ concluded that the relevant EU laws, Article 1431 of Directive 2006/11 and Article 1 of Directive 2006/79, must be interpreted as precluding national legislation like Poland's Article 522(1).
Precluding meaning, not allowing it.
Exactly. It means any national law that denies the VAT exemption for these small, non-commercial gifts just because the private recipient lives in a different EU member state than the one where the goods first arrived is simply incompatible with EU law. It cannot stand.
Wow. That's a very direct ruling.
Yeah.
It tells Poland and potentially any other country doing the same thing, your national rule violates EU law here. What does this practically mean for companies like LSC, the ones actually handling these packages, the freight forwarders?
Well, for taxable persons like LSC, this provides absolutely crucial clarity and consistency. Think about the operational nightmare they faced before.
Right, having to track the final destination for every small package.
Exactly. Imagine a package from the U.S. arrives in their hub in Poland. If it's for someone in Poland, fine, exempt. If it's identical but for someone in Germany, suddenly they might have had to calculate and charge Polish VAT, handle all the paperwork. It's hugely complex and inefficient.
Created an uneven playing field just based on where the recipient lived within the EU.
Totally. This ruling eliminates that headache. It streamlines the processes massively. They can now apply the exemption consistently, provide the package meets the criteria, occasional personal under 45, no payment, regardless of which EU country the recipient is in. It simplifies their cross-border operations within the EU enormously.
That's a big win for efficiency in the logistics sector. Does it have financial implications too? You mentioned that VAT article hinted at something.
Yes, and this is potentially huge. The VAT analysis pointed out that this ruling could open the door for companies like LSC, who might have been incorrectly charged VAT or had to charge their clients VAT under the old incorrect interpretation, to now seek refunds for those past payments.
Oh, so they could potentially claim back money wrongly paid.
Potentially, yes. Or at least benefit from clear exemptions going forward where they might have been charged before. This could have significant financial consequences for businesses that handled large volumes of these cross-border personal shipments. It's not just about future clarity. It could rectify past errors.
That's a major practical impact. Beyond the companies involved, what about the broader picture? What does this ruling tell us about EU law and policy more generally, how the EU works?
Well, on a broader level, it really underscores the principle of harmonization. It shows how vital it is to interpret EU rules consistently across all member states to make the single market actually function as intended.
National interpretations can't just override the common system.
Precisely. It reinforces that national law has to align not just with the letter, but also the spirit of EU directives, especially in areas like VAT, which are meant to be harmonized. Without that, the whole system fragments.
And it reinforces the idea of the EU as a single territory for customs and tax, at least in this context.
Yes, absolutely. It strengthens the concept of the EU as a single customs territory. Once goods like these small gifts have legally entered the EU in one country, the internal borders should effectively vanish for VAT purposes in this specific scenario.
Making it easier for people to connect across the EU.
Exactly. It facilitates that seamless movement of personal items, which is part of the bigger EU vision. No extra tax hurdles just because a package crossed an internal EU border after arriving from outside.
And lastly, you mentioned it's a good example of legal interpretation itself.
Definitely. It's a fantastic illustration that interpreting law isn't just about sticking to the literal words. The ECJ showed how crucial it is to understand the why, the purpose, the spirit, the context to apply the law correctly. It forces a kind of critical thinking, ensuring national laws align with the broader EU objectives, not just the narrow text. It's about making the whole system coherent.
So wrapping this up then, while a small gift from, across the ocean might seem like a tiny thing, this deep dive really shows how one court case can ripple out. It clarifies decades of EU tax law, and it ensures that the original spirit, facilitating those cross-border personal connections without unnecessary tax burdens inside the Union, is actually upheld.
Yeah, it really does. It highlights that continuous process, often behind the scenes, of knitting Europe together, even down to the level of small packages.
The ECJ's decision reinforces the words of the directives, sure, but also their fundamental purpose.
And it clearly demonstrates that ongoing dynamic, doesn't it, between national laws and practices and that overarching goal of EU-wide harmonization. It's a constant balancing act to make the EU function as one cohesive space.
It makes you wonder, though, what might this mean for other areas of EU law, places where national interpretations might still differ from that broader pan-European intent? How many other sort of border anomalies like this might still be lurking out there just waiting for a case or a deep dive to bring them into the light?
That's a really interesting thought. It highlights the continuous work needed to build and maintain this union, ensuring the grand vision actually translates into practical reality for everyone, day to day.